Welcome to the Health Edge, translating the science of self-care. I am Mark Pettis, and I'm with my friend, colleague, John Bagnulo. John, good morning, my friend.
Hey, good morning, Mark. Great to see you.
Great to see you, as always. We have been looking at some research on a topic that, again, I think is so fascinating, John, as it relates to the acid production of the foods that we eat, and the extent to which many observational studies suggest that the more acid from foods that we consume, that we produce over the course of the day, the greater the likelihood of developing more chronic complex diseases, from diabetes to obesity to cardiovascular disease. And there has long been an approach around alkalinizing foods and the alkaline diets through the years that have had a wide range of touted health benefits, from reducing cancer risk, improving outcomes, general health across the board improvements. And so it seemed a really good time to look at that in more detail and with more granularity. And I think, like many things that we emphasize, John, in our conversations, the acid production from a food that we consume is another example of a non-nutritive attribute.
Yeah.
And some non-nutritive attributes, like getting polyphenols from plant-based foods, and in this example, the amount of acid one produces or not, having a potential for wide-ranging health effects, is really important, because not everything comes down to, right, how much particular nutrients that a
Yeah.
food contains. And so it'll be interesting to look at this from that perspective.
Yeah, no, it's an awesome topic, and I think for several reasons. Number one of which is, it touches every area of medicine, right? You can't, when you look at how far-reaching the effects of like a chronic kind of like subacute metabolic acidosis is, right? It affects every area, right? Skeletal health, muscular health, obviously, renal health, the health of our liver, cardiovascular. It's incredible. And if I can just back up for a minute, it's interesting because, you said that for a long time there have been so many advocates or approaches that would recommend for patients that have one condition or another a more alkaline diet, right? And some of that would be cultural. There are different cultures where this is much more appreciated. And then there are some approaches that might have developed here in the US, for instance, that use this as a big part of their like advocacy for a certain way of eating. And what's interesting is those different approaches, as you and I can both appreciate, they have been received in a very, very diverse, right, set of conditions. Like, some people totally dismiss that. A lot of, like, traditional Western medicine is like, there's nothing to this alkaline loaded diet, which I find fascinating because, I'm pretty sure, and I know with your area of expertise, as a nephrologist, this is gonna be ingrained, right, in what you learn. But I think most people that take a biochemistry course or have at least a basic understanding of human physiology, have to realize that, yeah, the body does need to maintain a blood pH of 7.39, right, or very close to that. And it's got a few mechanisms by which it can do that. And when that doesn't happen, when you have like just this chronic acid load being placed on the body, well, the compensation is going to take its toll in one system or another, right? Which we see. So I think it's an amazing topic for those reasons. And I think a lot of the confusion, at least, again, I just want to put this out there in case it helps our listeners. When you and I are talking about, the acidic contributions that a food makes, I just want to make sure everyone understands that it's post digestion and absorption. It's not the pH of a food when it's in our glass or when we take a bite of that food, because a lot of those foods, that I hear people say, well, coffee, isn't coffee that's an acidic food. It's only acidic when you drink it, but it actually has a net like alkaline effect on the body because it doesn't really have any protein, doesn't have a phosphorus or a sulfur content. So it's just a modest amount of potassium at the end of the day. And so I just think that is also an area of confusion that immediately you lose certain people when you start talking about the pH of a food. We're talking about, and you did a great job of articulating that a moment ago. How does that contribute, like acidogenic, right? How does it make that type of effect on the body? And it really comes down to protein, phosphorus, and sulfur. The more of those nutrients that a food contains, the more it's going to contribute to this metabolic acid load. The more potassium, calcium, and magnesium a particular food contains, and less of the phosphorus and sulfur and protein, the more of an alkaline contributing food. And so if we start there, I think it can add a little clarity, whether that's for a person interested in improving their health or a clinician, because I know you in the past as well. I've talked to clinicians and I've said, I just think this person has bone loss because there's just no potassium in their diet. There's no source of helping the body neutralize all the acids in their diet. And that's kind of just been like, I get raised eyebrows with that. So in any event, I love the topic. And I'll end here because it's also one that emphasizes balance, right? We're such a monolithic society. And I can be guilty of that as well. I can I can look at a person's blood work, or I could think about a certain angle to take, and then that really becomes the dominant approach. But this really brings us back to the importance of balance, which, look, ancestral medicine, that's the one thing it should teach us, right? Is that the body needs balance in every way, right? And this is a great example of that. If we're just really focused on eliminating carbohydrates and loading up on protein, you can lose some really important components of that balance. And obviously, that happens. We have people that are making all the wrong choices with carbohydrate dense foods. That's a big part of our, society's problems as well. But it's really about balance and making sure that every meal has this kind of weighed approach, right? Where we're getting enough of those alkaline contributors, but we also need to make sure we get enough protein. And once that kind of mindset, I think, is developed, I think it helps everybody remarkably.
Yeah, that's just the perfect prologue for what we're going to be diving into here, John. And hopefully, just looking at some of this research, we can bring a little clarity. But it's just so important what you said about the big picture, because we don't want people to come away thinking, animal protein produces more acid, therefore it's horrible, avoid it at all
Yeah,
costs,
right.
which has been the clinical meme.
Yeah,
Not so much because of the acid, because of the cholesterol, and right.
yeah,
But it's really important that one not condemn a food based on that attribute alone. If,
right.
and this is where the balance becomes so important. Well, I'm going to share my
Yeah,
screen here, John, and we'll. And you've already beautifully set the stage for this, but I did think it would be helpful to
oh yeah, this is great.
defining terms here. And really, so the question we're trying to help reconcile, does acid production from the foods that we eat drive metabolic disease? And as you suggested, John, this is a much more nuanced story. But frequently, when you look at the research that we will be looking at, the researchers will refer to DAL, the dietary acid load. And again, just quick definitions. This is a very high level term that looks at the net balance of acidifying versus alkalinizing foods in the diet. So it's total dietary intake. And then there are formulas that one would use to calculate the acid contributing and the alkalinizing contributing. And one would just sort of look at the balance of that. What one tends to see more specifically in research studies is what's referred to as the PRAL, or the potential renal acid load. And to your point, John, this is after the food is digested, after that food is burned as a fuel. So these are the metabolic byproducts of metabolism of these foods. And so this is, again, these are formulas that, again, to the point that you raised, John, when you look at the sulfur and the phosphorus in a food, that is really how the calculation of acid contribution is made. When one looks at the potassium, magnesium, calcium of those foods, that contributes to the alkalinizing contribution. And so it's a more commonly employed term and measure, where a positive score would suggest net acid and a negative score net alkalinizing. And then this last term, this NEAP, this net endogenous acid production, is a measure of both the acid contribution from metabolizing the foods that we eat. We might call that exogenous. And then there's the internal acid production just from metabolic processes that we require day to day just to maintain our ability to function. And so not all acid that is produced in the body comes from the food that we eat. And here you're
And that
looking
would include like the uric acid we talked about, a couple weeks ago. And yeah,
exactly,
right.
John. It might maybe someone has lactic acid
Yeah.
from ischemia. They're not getting enough circulation to their extremities, for example. It might be someone who's got poorly controlled diabetes and has some keto acids. And so this is just a more global measure, including food and non-food contributors. So just to kind of set the stage for these definitions. And again, when you look at sort of the published literature, the average acid, production that which the kidneys confront, because as we'll emphasize, the kidneys are the primary way that we buffer or neutralize acid that is produced. So, the average PRAL in the American diet will be anywhere from 50 to 80 milliequivalents of acid per day. When you look at mean values, and often you'll see mean values used because when you're looking at averages, people that have a really, really high PRAL might falsely raise the average in a way that when you look at mean values, a mean value is of the value where 50% fall below, 50% fall above. It's a little less skewed by what might be a smaller percentage of people with a really high PRAL. And so when you look at means, you'll see this in the 24 approximately milliequivalent per day.
And Mark, hey, the one thing, if I could add to this, these are some great talking points here. And I don't want to overwhelm our listeners with bad news, but this one slide I think says a lot. First of all, we know that the average American adult probably doesn't consume enough protein, right? Especially older adults. So what's really startling about this is you look at this, you see the high PRAL value, and that is with a current set of conditions where we're not consuming enough protein. So, right? So think about that. Like if we actually consumed as much protein as we need to support more lean body mass. Well, the PRAL is going to go up unless we make the concomitant increase in alkaline contributing food. So like everything has to improve, right? We need more protein, and we also need more of an ability to buffer out the acid that's gonna come from the result of that protein's metabolism. And I think that's what's really like crazy when you look at this is that here we've got a population in the US that already has a very high PRAL and they're not eating enough protein.
Yeah. I mean, that is such a great point, John. And we'll come back to this repeatedly because at the end of the day, you don't want to throw the baby out with the
Right.
bathwater.
Yeah.
Most people need more protein,
Right.
and animal protein, as we talk about, has the most complete in terms of essential, non-essential amino acids and the best bioavailability. So much greater
Yeah.
percentage of that protein is absorbed and utilized into muscle protein synthesis and lean body, all of these things
Yeah.
that are important. So,
We don't want the crosshairs to be put, and too often I think the plant-based community does this. They put the crosshairs of this problem on the protein intake.
yes.
And really, we have to make a huge shift in the perspective on this issue.
And that's where the second bullet
Yeah,
point,
right.
key drivers, begins to bring us to what you were saying, John, that while it's true that animal proteins will have a higher PRAL, it's the processed foods and the refined grains which
Yeah,
are so problematic. Not only do they have a high PRAL, but they have very little nutritional value. They're right low in protein, low in fiber, and they're very high glycemic. Um, so if one looks at this and says, "Oh man, I need to cut back on my animal protein," that again, just to emphasize the
yeah,
huge point that you made, John, really one wants to start by making sure you're getting good and adequate protein, which is a minimum of 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram of
yeah.
body weight
Minimum.
a day,
Yeah,
minimum, and um, whole sources of pasture-raised meats and whole fat dairy and eggs is not where you want to be cutting back.
yeah,
It's processed meats, certainly processed foods, refined grains, flour.
yeah.
Um, that's really the bullseye on the target. And much
Yeah,
the
and
same,
hey, to build on what you just said about the grains, I mean, first of all, the whole grains aren't going to make too much of a difference. So, while refined grains are the worst, right, the whole grains aren't going to really help you very much with your net acid load either. And back in the late 90s, I think it was like 1998, Tufts did a study on women over the age of 50 and bone loss, and they found that it wasn't actually the animal protein uh, that was associated with greater or accelerated bone loss at age 50. It was actually the more servings of grains and cereals that women ate. And this is a large number of women that were in this study. And it got headlines at the time. A lot of this has unfortunately it's fallen on deaf ears or it's been lost, but it was the women that had the greatest volume of dietary cereal, grains, and foods made with those things, flours, that had the most bone loss. And I just think that, that really gives us a much better insight, right? Than again, thinking that, the eggs we're eating or the meat we're eating is somehow that's what's responsible for the average, woman's bone loss. It's just not the case.
yeah. And to your point, John, we know that more animal uh, protein consumption is
Better,
associated with
better.
better
Yeah,
bone and connective
exactly.
tissue integrity. So this is
Yeah,
where it's really important not to
yeah,
focus on one attribute uh, without considering the holistic effect of all
yeah.
that comes with that food source and how that food source is balanced with
Right.
other foods. So that's such a great uh, point of emphasis. Well, so and again, we talk about the fact that we don't get enough of these alkaline producing foods. So eating a prime rib um, without any vegetables, and we're not here to talk about the carnivore diet, and there's certainly a
Yeah,
lot of there's a lot of interest in this out there, a lot of testimonials. There's no question that when one switches to essentially a zero carb diet, that many metabolic things will get better and
Absolutely.
many
It's a step
biomarkers
in the
will
right
get
direction.
better.
Yeah,
And I think
absolutely.
it can be a remarkable reset for someone who's struggling. Um, we just don't have good long-term data, and so here again, the emphasis on balancing animal protein sources with good alkalinizing plant-based foods. I mean, you said something years ago, John, that was etched into my DNA. This simple concept of getting 2 cups of greens a day,
Yeah.
and that's a great example of a beautiful alkalinizing balance to whatever acid-producing food that you might be getting, and so this high
At the minimum,
PRAL.
Mark, at the minimum, just quickly on that, I mean, just so people understand, it depends on the greens, but you got some things that are off the charts in terms of how much acid they can neutralize. Like when you get into, and they're more esoteric. These aren't things that people are going to eat regularly. I'm fully aware of that, but a cup of dandelion greens, a cup of Swiss chard. I mean, that has the ability to neutralize like an 8 ounce steak or, even more of a certain like fish. You could neutralize 8 ounces of steak, 4 or 5 eggs, 10 ounces or 12 ounces of salmon with that volume of greens. So it doesn't take a lot of certain greens, but even like romaine lettuce, a couple cups of chopped romaine lettuce can neutralize, like a chicken breast or, 3 or 4 eggs. And I think people lose sight of that. We're not talking about mountains and mountains of vegetables. And to add to what you say, look, I think the carnivore diet for a lot of people is a huge step in the right direction. And I feel the same way about like just the Atkins diet, which has got, there's mountains of evidence that it can take someone from metabolic syndrome to a better place, right? I think what you and I always try to do is to try to help people find the next level or to see, like maybe a better destination, a better point. It's always important to recognize that. Like these approaches get people on the right path, but I don't know as though they're long term. This isn't what you want to be on indefinitely. You want to be able to weave in a more balanced approach. And it doesn't mean you bring back grains or cereals or you bring back, refined carbs. No, we're not talking about that. We're just talking about bringing back some ancestral foods that human populations really subsisted on along with the meats and in the fish and everything else. So yeah, it's again, we're just people get really locked into this like one approach or there's just one way and it's a lot of times those one ways are really you're going in the right direction, but you probably don't want to stay locked into that much of a reductionistic way of eating.
Absolutely. This is just a schematic of
Yeah,
how the
this is great.
kidneys manage acid. And again, the kidneys do this 24/7. And so most of the acid that is produced, both from foods we eat as well as endogenous metabolic effects, the kidneys do a beautiful job of, they will take that acid and most of it is excreted in the urine in the form of ammonium. Um, the kidneys make ammonia, which is that odor that people might notice, particularly in a more concentrated first morning urine. And that ammonia will take a proton, that acid, to form ammonium, and is excreted. And people with normal kidney function will do this superbly well. Another part of that acid is excreted by what's called titratable acid, and this is often using phosphate as the kidney filters phosphate. Um, that phosphate can take on the proton, and the combination of that with ammonia production really, for the overwhelming majority of people with normal kidney function, will allow you to handle um, what is your mean or typical PRAL for the day. The kidneys are also really good when they have to at reabsorbing, holding on to things that the body might be more in need of. In this case, bicarbonate, which is the the primary buffer in our in the extracellular fluid, that fluid around that bathes our cells. And so bicarbonate is the primary buffer, and the kidneys do a pretty good job of that. What's important is that people with a chronic acid load will often have and most of the time will have a normal bicarbonate level in the blood uh, because of their efficacy at maintaining that. So you really can't.
That's a really important point, Mark. What you're saying here is critical for our listeners because a lot of times, there'll be pushback against this entire concept and I've had people come up to me and say, "Do you mean to tell me that if I test my patient's blood, it's going to be?" And the answer is absolutely not. And it's the same thing with if we want to test the bicarbonate ion. That's like the last place. And things are going to be really bad when you see that a shift in the pH of the blood or you see a significant loss of bicarbonate ion, right? I mean, it's triage. And that's what the body maintains until there's a complete breakdown elsewhere. So anyways, I just find that important. I love that you bring that up. It's like those levels are going to look like and they're going to be physiologically acceptable until there's a complete crash, right? And at that point, you're in full blown like acidosis, and that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about, like an acute ketoacidosis. What we're talking about here is low grade metabolic acidosis, where that measuring someone's bicarbonate, it's not going to tell you anything.
Yeah, exactly, John. Great point. Nothing with respect to our diet from this perspective will show up in your blood pH or in your serum bicarbonate. Where you will see an effect is in the urine pH. The urine pH is a bit of a surrogate for acid load, and so that first morning urine pH with what might be a higher PRAL intake, you will see a maximally acidic urine. Generally, that urine pH will be much less than 6. So urine pH, as it turns out, is a better surrogate for this balance of acidification and alkalinization. It's not used routinely unless you're a kidney stone former, where um, alkalinizing the urine becomes a very important strategy uh, to mitigate stone propagation and new stone formation. So a urine pH is for those who are interested, is a better sort of surrogate for that. If you look at, again, we've touched on this, these are just very general categories. So, the more acid producing foods will tend to be animal protein sources. This is a huge one as it's the mainstay of the standard American diet, right? Grains and
Yeah.
starches and then sugar, processed foods. So
And
again,
interestingly, yeah, absolutely, Mark. And interestingly, when it comes to grains and starches, rice has by far the lowest acid load. Wheat has the worst.
yeah,
So some of that, may or may not be relevant to our listeners. But if you think about the number of cultures that rely predominantly on rice as opposed to wheat, they tend to fare much better when you look at everything from all-cause mortality to any of these chronic diseases that are associated with higher PRAL or acid-loaded diets. So I find that interesting, anyways. But yeah,
yeah, and again, alkalinizing foods are certainly going to be, root vegetables, greens, and some, avocado, some, beans, legumes, things that we've touched on are
yeah, and the real heavy hitters here for our listeners, and it surprises people. Tomatoes are an incredible. They have an incredibly low negative PRAL value. So tomatoes actually help us neutralize large amounts of acid. And spinach is the most commonly consumed green leafy vegetable, with again incredible ability here to contribute to that whole potassium bicarbonate system, and avocados. So those are three real valuable. Whereas a banana, it's decent, but it doesn't give you the same return on your sugar consumption, your carbohydrate as the others. So sweet potatoes, spinach, avocados, tomatoes, those are by far the four biggest players. That if you can find a way to keep those in your diet on a regular basis, you can see that with spinach and avocados and even tomatoes, you can still be on a low carb diet and have a very, very balanced approach. I'm sorry about that. I
Excellent. No,
digressed there.
no, no, John, that's great. And we talk a lot about ancestral approaches, and so much can be learned from studying how the dwindling ancestral cultures today subside. And you'll see PRAL values in my review of this, John, really over a very wide range. Those closer to the equator, equatorial, you will have more access to alkalinizing produce and fruits, vegetables, and as you migrate more northward, you'll see greater consumption of animal protein. And so there's the point of this is that there's a wide range of PRALs and ancestral cultures, and they will often vary during the year, depending on the climate, the growth season, what's available. But what you see in all cultures is this tendency toward balance, as you point out,
Yeah,
John.
a couple other papers that I know you're aware of, Mark. Our listeners might find interesting. One is by Lauren Cordain, 1997, Origins and Implications of the Western Diet in light of our ancestral history. And then Boyd Eaton had several papers, and their PRAL values, to your point here, would suggest that our ancestors were very balanced. This is Paleolithic era, okay? So we're going back,
Yeah.
going back at least 10,000 years. Root vegetables were huge, and then to the point you're making, as human populations move further away from the equatorial regions, that our ancestors had to take concerted efforts to prevent acidosis. Everybody's heard stories about, what happened to the pioneers that just ate rabbits and didn't eat higher fat foods. They developed acidosis at a really extreme level, to the point where they died. I mean, it was toxic levels, right? But cultures that might live farther north than you're going to have access to any type of fruit or vegetable would do things like they'd crush oyster shells and consume that, which is, again, it's mostly calcium carbonate. So I mean, they would do whatever they could, even thousands of years ago, to try to neutralize acid that they couldn't identify, but they knew was having systemic effects on early human populations. So it's really remarkable how our ancestors were aware of the importance of this without actually being able to put their finger on, what the process was.
Yeah, that's great, John. And it uh, reminds me of the great Jared Diamond, the Pulitzer Prize
Yeah,
winning author
awesome.
of Guns, Germs, and Steels, and
Yeah,
the World Until Yesterday,
yeah.
and the very famous quote that I think was in Discover magazine, 1999, where he talks about this transition from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic, where the advent of agriculture might be looked upon as the single greatest and most devastating shift in human evolution, uh, based on
Awesome books.
right,
Awesome
right,
books.
the
Yeah,
need, right, to you have these more population dense areas migrating. Needed to develop agriculture, and they were growing grains and right
yeah,
wheat, and there were some advantages there to store that food, to have availability during harsh times. But when you look at the archaeologic data, uh,
yeah.
you know, within generations of shifting, you see differences in skull, dental jaw anatomy, bone anatomy. Humans become much shorter.
The fossil record does not lie.
The fossil record speaks to the downside of introducing right these
Yeah.
wholesale mono commodity grains, and
And the
that's
population, Mark, the population that not, again, Jared Diamond, you gave me The World Until Yesterday. That's one of my favorite all-time books. For our listeners that aren't familiar with Jared Diamond's work, I mean, he, in the late 60s, as an anthropologist at UCLA, he would travel to Papua New Guinea and spend time with the New Guinea Highlanders. And he did this for 2 decades. And that they are in lesser today than 20 years ago, but they have been considered one of the last living examples of a Paleolithic kind of hunter-gatherer society, but more Neolithic, to your point, because they did cultivate sweet potatoes. And that was the one crop that they planted, harvested, and got a significant percentage of their calories. Now, what's interesting about this population is that as a New Guinea Highlander gets older, their blood pressure goes down. As a New Guinea Highlander gets older, right, their bone density improves. And researchers from all around the world, not just because of Jared Diamond's work, but because of some of the evidence that was coming forth about just the incredible, like paradox to what we were seeing elsewhere in the developed world, they would travel there totally bewildered by the physiological changes that took place over the aging cycle that just people couldn't explain. But the net acid load is a big part of the story, right? Because sweet potatoes are amazing. There's no grains in their diet. And it's just, they're constantly in a low to zero PRAL daily balance. And so their body is always mineralizing and their body is maintaining lean body mass at a much, much easier it's a much easier process for the human body to maintain muscle mass and lean body mass overall when it's not constantly compensating, robbing Peter to pay Paul, so to speak, with potassium. So, I mean, look, if our listeners read Guns, Germs, and Steel, if they haven't, I'm sure a lot of our listeners have. So much of the ancestral picture just clicks in just the first few pages of that book.
It sure does. And the take home message there for me, John, is choose your plant carefully.
Yeah, right.
Not all plants are created equal.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
yeah, give me the sweet potato over the wheat
yeah.
any day of the week. We see, and I'll put these open source review articles up on our um, website, John, thehealthedgepodcast.com. But you can see a fair amount of epidemiologic observational data that clearly shows that um, people with a high PRAL chronically, that so it overwhelms their kidneys' ability to neutralize. And again, these are frequently standard American diets that have very little alkalinizing balance with the foods that we've talked about. There's no question that you see a much higher prevalence of chronic complex disease over time. These are correlations, and we're trying to offer some mechanistic perspective here, just to add a little bit of clarity. And as we talked about, this is a very busy slide, but it's from this paper. Uh, it it's really hard to measure through traditional ways any change in systemic or extracellular fluid pH. The kidneys are just so damn good at balancing that you will not see those changes and day to day in the absence of some catastrophic event like ketoacidosis or lactic acidosis that's overwhelming, or acute kidney injury that overwhelms the kidney's ability to handle an acid load. Otherwise, these chronic low-level microenvironmental changes will not be picked up. If you do look at urinary pH, and I'm not recommending people do this unless they form kidney stones, but that morning pH and your pH throughout the day, it's just a dipstick of a urine sample, is really very, very helpful. And that's a nice way of looking at whether your kidneys have the need to maximally acidify, which they will only do if the acid load they're confronted with requires that maximal acidification of the urine. So I put this up here just for those who are saying, what can I measure?
Yeah, this is great. This is great, Mark, because I think, like, to your point, not everyone has to do this, but if you have, like, let's say you're someone that has a lot of bone loss, or you feel like you lose lean body mass much more quickly than you'd expect, which we'll maybe explain in a moment. when we look at potential mechanisms that go on here. But I think measuring urinary pH, look, I think it has value for people, not forever, but just do it for a week, and look how your last meal of the day, to your point, affects that first, diuresis in the morning.
Yeah,
First
and
urine sample, yeah.
that's where you will see maximum acidification after that overnight fast. So um, it can also be a good way to see how concentrated your urine is in the
Yeah.
morning, and maybe you're not getting enough water. So yeah, it's obviously an easy and very inexpensive thing to do. And let's just look at a few more studies here. Um, that again are observational. And I brought these up. Some you have shared with me, John, which are just outstanding. But just to give people a sense of what's out there, this was published earlier in 2025. This looked at the association between dietary acid load, risk of metabolic dysfunction, with, in particular, fatty liver and in people with type 2 diabetes. So these were people who already had metabolic disruption. And what they do typically in these observational studies is they stratify from lowest to highest. In this example, the PRAL, and in this example, the net acid production with respect to diabetes, and what you find is that as you go from a low PRAL to the highest PRAL in people with diabetes, that the risk of fatty liver goes up. These are hazard ratios. So in this example, the highest PRAL tended to have about 2 to 3 times the risk of fatty liver compared to those with the lowest PRAL. If you looked at net acid production, which is a bit more of an accurate measure of what the kidneys are actually left with at the end of the day, taking into account both dietary and non-dietary, the hazard ratios in the lowest to the highest acid producers is 4+ times. So these are pretty significant changes. Relatively small numbers of people. But again, the point here is that fatty liver, as a very important inflammatory feature of a metabolic syndrome, does tend to correlate more strongly with higher acid production. And again, these are similar methodologies. In this example, looking at cancer risk and prognosis. So this was Frontiers in Medicine from 2022. And again, this is a forest plot looking at various studies. And this is a null effect, no difference one way or the other. This one value, anything to the right would suggest a correlation. Anything to the left would suggest a risk reduction. And so this open diamond here is just sort of an average of what these several studies show, with a slight increase in the hazard ratio of cancer progression and worsening prognosis. Again, these aren't, when you look at these hazard ratios, they're not off the chart big. But if you have cancer and you're not getting a lot of plant-based alkalinizing foods, you're eating too many refined grains and flour, wheat, you can appreciate how that would very much influence any clinical outcome, where the acid production is really just a manifestation, one attribute that correlates. But these are people who probably aren't getting enough nutrient density in the foods that they're consuming, and just aren't, getting enough fiber, all of the things that we frequently talk about. But I think here you see this reflected in terms of the acid production. And again, these are all just variations on the theme here.
This was a good one though, Mark, and I really appreciate you sending this one to me because they did get into the mechanisms for each of the different chronic diseases as it relates to net acid load, potential renal acid load. And I thought what was really fascinating to me, under each chronic disease, the effect of extracellular changes in the pH on, for instance, insulin resistance. And what had been shown, at least in animal models, is that if you reduce the pH of the extracellular fluid, that you do drive insulin resistance, and that there may be a protective mechanism there by which the body could more effectively break down protein, skeletal muscle, when that happens. So much like we talked about with this evolutionary use of fructose, it was something similar here where, if you had a very, very acidic condition setting in on the body, that there would be a survival mechanism to driving insulin resistance. You'd catabolize more skeletal muscle, you generate more of that ammonium to act as a base. So I thought that was really interesting. The other thing that I wanted to hear your thoughts on was it did reference an improvement in or a reduction in all-cause mortality. So with the use of sodium bicarbonate by dialysis patients. And I'm sure you've met people that use baking soda. It's like folk medicine, right? So immediately you lose you lose a lot of people when you start, whether it's apple cider vinegar or it's baking soda. People just kind of roll their eyes. But what was really clear from the section in that paper on renal disease was that patients that did eventually go on dialysis, they did fare much better and had a much lower all-cause mortality when they use baking soda as part of their approach. And what do you think about that? Because I come across it from in working with athletes, sports medicine now. There are a lot of athletes using baking soda to neutralize or be more effective at neutralizing lactic acid. What about for our listeners that know that this might be an issue for them? Is that something they would maybe consider, just even if it's temporarily?
Yeah, that is a really good question, John. And I brought up one of the
Oh,
tables
good,
from
excellent,
the
yeah,
paper looking at um, supplemental, if you will, strategies that can accompany dietary intake to lower acid production
yeah,
that certainly range from what we've been talking about, alkalinizing foods, eliminating, of course, those acid producing, particularly grain and processed carbs, from alkalinizing agents like sodium citrate, sodium bicarbonate, potassium citrate. These are the most commonly, there's alkalinized water, but for the most part, these are the supplements that have been most time tested in my
yeah,
experience in the renal world. And sodium bicarbonate was a standard addition to a renal diet for all people with end stage renal disease, and the acid production in somebody with end stage renal disease on dialysis, in addition to being huge because the kidneys can no longer handle that acid load, you have to restrict high potassium and high magnesium foods in people with end stage renal disease because the
yeah,
kidney's ability to excrete potassium and magnesium is so compromised that you can quickly develop life-threatening elevations of potassium and magnesium. And I've got some stories there that would make your hair stand on end. I've seen people's potassium go up um, quickly enough for them to become
hyper
paralyzed
hyperkalemic,
from the
hyperkalemic,
legs up, and
yeah,
literally
wow,
within minutes away from cardiac arrest, short of getting them on dialysis. And so these are so you can't eat the alkalinizing foods to the same extent that
yeah,
somebody without. So it is a huge issue. Um, I think. While I'm not convinced that the mortality benefits are great, I think the data there is a bit mixed. Not
okay,
everyone can tolerate sodium bicarbonate. And the doses required to neutralize daily acid load. A lot of people get gastrointestinal intolerance.
Yeah.
So there can be a dose limitation in terms of side effects, but there's no question it's an effective strategy. And there you will see it in the electrolytes when you measure that bicarbonate, only because it's a more severe acidemia. The potassium citrate has a lot more supportive research in people who are kidney stone formers. And in my view, almost anyone who forms kidney stones should be taking potassium citrate a few times a day to alkalinize the urine. So many people who form kidney stones
Yeah.
do so on the basis of high uric acid, which we've talked about
Sure.
recently. And as you alkalinize the urine, the kidney's ability to excrete much larger amounts of uric acid is made possible. The dissociation of uric acid into urate goes up dramatically. So you can clear that uric acid in orders of magnitude greater when you alkalinize the urine, and potassium citrate is a really effective way of doing that.
How
I
many
do think
milligrams? How many milligrams of potassium, just to help our listeners? This would be for someone with, again, healthy kidney function. How many milligrams of potassium are in that 3 grams of potassium citrate?
you're probably getting
Couple hundred, right?
yeah, at least I would say several hundred
Okay.
milligrams of potassium. Yeah.
Okay.
Uh, and so, it, I do think, and I've yet to see the research. I know you look at the research in terms of intense activity and performance in terms of mitigating lactic acid. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that at another time and another
Yeah.
topic, John. But I've yet to see good research looking at the addition of, say, potassium citrate in somebody on a carnivore diet, you know, or somebody on a ketogenic diet, something with higher protein and lower carb, and how that might affect long-term outcomes. I don't believe that
That's
that
not out there. No,
exists.
that study's not out there. All that we know right now are the sodium bicarbonate, you know, uh, those trials, which are definitely favorable to your point that you have to be able to tolerate the sodium bicarbonate, and that has been circumnavigated as of late with the use of enterically coated capsules and these hydrogels that you don't get that reaction in the stomach. It gets into the small intestine, and those trials are showing significant benefits to athletic performances where lactic acid is the rate limiting factor, right? A 400-meter, 800-meter event, but even in the more recent past couple of years, marathon runners who do have some of that lactic acid accumulation towards the end of a run when they really take up the intensity or pick up the pace, so to speak, in the last mile or two, they're also using sodium bicarbonate effectively. So it's really changing. For many athletes, it's changing their ability to tolerate lactic acid. What's interesting though is that, to your point, we have so many athletes that are using ketogenic diets as part of their training. So they're better at any given intensity of burning fat. Whether that's a cyclist or whatever. And there isn't any research right now on the use of potassium citrate in those athletes, larger doses of it, and it's interesting that there isn't. But I do know that there have been a few studies that have looked at a low PRAL, reducing the renal acid load for 4 or 5 days, and then looking at an athlete's ability to clear lactic acid, and those too have been very favorable. Any athlete that goes on a low renal acid load diet for, I think it's 4 days, they have shown at least a modest improvement in their ability to clear lactic acid when they bring it to the anaerobic threshold or a very high intensity. So I think this, again, I think we're covering a topic here today that it reaches into not only areas of medicine, but into sports performance. And I think we're at the front of the wave here with this. I think this will be implemented into more disciplines, as we go forward. Something like cancer treatment, to your point, where the mechanism is less understood and you don't see quite the risk reduction that you do with other chronic diseases. Maybe that'll be the last to adopt this as part of a, an oncologist's approach. That would be my feeling. But I think when you get into skeletal changes, skeletal muscular health, you get into that area, I just think there's unequivocal evidence now that it's a game changer. And I think those will be the first areas of medicine to adopt this. Well, can't tell you how
Going to be
many years that'll
exciting
be. Yeah.
to see that evolve. So as we bring this home, John, I mean, my takeaways are that when you look at the epidemiology of chronic complex disease, and when you look at changes in the diet of Americans over the last 3 generations, there's no question that the PRAL value of the standard American diet as compared to more ancestral approaches day to day tends to be higher. And no one can deny the correlations between that attribute, that change, and the growing and ongoing growing prevalence of chronic complex disease. The other takeaway for me is that while this is real, the opportunity largely in terms of reducing acid producing foods, PRAL foods, would be to focus more on the grains, refined grains, sugar, processed foods, without immediately going to the animal protein, though I think good sources of that animal protein are important. The processed meat will not be the same as a nice pasture raised, finished piece of beef, but that assuring adequate protein, as you emphasized, and then reducing processed foods and the grains, flour, would be one great opportunity on the reducing acid promoting foods. And then, of course, the corollary to that is getting more alkalinizing foods, whether that comes in the form of many of the foods that you emphasize, the plant-based foods, avocados, Swiss chard, and tomatoes, and really that is the one really nice way of creating better balance with respect to this acid alkaline connection. And then lastly, considering monitoring pHs of one's urine, I think can be really helpful just to give you a sense of what your acid load might be. Your kidneys will reveal that to you, and those patterns might be helpful as you play with foods that you're eating in relationship to that. So those are a few of
Yeah.
my takeaways, John.
Absolutely. I love that. Give yourself a litmus test, I mean, and that's what those pH strips are basically going to do. Just do it for a week. And then you should really be able to dial in, what your acid load is, at least for the night before, maybe even the whole day before. And then the other thing is, I'm a big fan of making shakes and smoothies. I do that and I try to make them really high protein. I make most of my protein shakes are 50 or 60 grams of protein in a 24-ounce bottle, but I make sure that I weave in like a couple really high potassium foods. And avocado's easy to throw in the blender. But you've got other really good choices too, whether it's a handful of spinach. I mean, and what some people might benefit from, Mark, and I'll just leave our listeners with this, is there are so many different powders now that give you varying milligrams of potassium citrate. I think LMNT is something that a lot of people use. I think it's 1,000 milligrams of potassium in one of those little sachets. That's going to have significant contributions in terms of neutralizing acid and helping reduce the PRAL for that smoothie, that shake that you make or whatever. So, take some of those real heavy hitters and weave them into your shaker bottle or your blender. And like you said, get a sense for where you're at, either by looking at the total day and what foods you had that might be high in potassium, or try to find the balance there. But I think those pH strips are great. And I think that's really, really a great tool for people to consider using for at least a short period of time. Not like you got to do it for the next 2 years. Just do it for a week. Great
Thank
stuff,
you,
though,
John.
man.
Yeah,
Great stuff.
great stuff. And we hope this was of some value to our Health Edge listeners. All of The many papers that we reference that are open source, we will have available on our website, thehealthedgepodcast.com. If you want to check out the videos, our YouTube channel, obviously you can see all the content there. We'll also have the slide deck on our website. And always a lot of fun, John, and always a learning experience.
Absolutely.
I always
Absolutely. I'm
away with
grateful for
greater
you.
insight.
I'm
I,
grateful for you, buddy. Love you.
yeah, love you too, John. This is it feels really good to share and to connect, and so thank you for that. And we wish our Health Edge listeners well. Be well, stay well, and don't forget to love yourself. And John, we'll see you next week.
Sounds great, buddy.